What were those cheap dinners that kept Black families going in the 1960s? These dinners turned scraps and staples into plates that filled stomachs and brought everyone to the table. And if they could make so much out of so little, why can't we? Mustard greens with salt pork were the kind of dish that spoke to both thrift and tradition. Collard greens were loved, but when money was tight, mustard greens filled the pot just as well, with a sharper bite and a quicker cook. My grandmother simmered them slowly with scraps of salt pork, the fat melting into the broth until every leaf carried flavor. The kitchen smelled earthy, smoky, and strong, reminding everyone that even the humblest greens could feel like a feast when seasoned with care. She always said the broth, what some called potlikker, was the best part, soaking it up with cornbread to make sure not a drop was wasted. It was a dish that brought families together around the table, passing bowls and breaking bread even when meat was scarce. Salt pork was cheap because it was mostly fat, but it gave depth to every bite, transforming greens into comfort. In the 1960s, this was not just a side, it was supper, filling bellies after long days of work. Mustard greens with salt pork carried heritage, thrift, and resilience in one simmering pot. Rice and molasses supper was one of the simplest meals, but also one of the most remembered. A pot of rice was inexpensive, filling, and always on hand, but paired with a drizzle of molasses, it turned into something sweet and sustaining. Sugar was too costly for everyday use, but molasses was affordable and sold in larger tins that seemed to last forever. Families poured it over steaming bowls of rice, letting the dark syrup seep into the grains until they gleamed. The taste was rich, almost smoky, with just enough sweetness to make children smile. It was often eaten at the end of the day when no meat could be spared, and it carried people through the night with enough strength to face the next morning. My grandmother told me rice and molasses was a treat disguised as necessity, proof that resourcefulness could soften the edge of scarcity. In the 1960s, when Black families were stretching every dollar, rice and molasses kept hunger at bay while still offering a touch of comfort. Simple, cheap, and unforgettable, it was a meal born of need but remembered with love. Stewed field peas with cornbread was a Southern staple that seemed to appear on tables no matter how hard times got. Field peas were inexpensive, easy to grow, and dried well enough to last through seasons, making them a dependable ingredient when other food was scarce. My grandmother simmered them slowly with onion, maybe a scrap of pork if any was left, until the peas broke down into a thick, savory stew. Cornbread was baked alongside, crumbly and warm, and served as the perfect companion, soaking up every bit of broth. Together they made a full meal, packed with enough substance to keep workers fed after long days in the fields or factories. Field peas were humble compared to black-eyed peas or butter beans, but they carried a taste of the land, earthy and comforting. For families with little money to spare, this pairing was dependable, stretching across generations as a dish of both necessity and pride. Stewed field peas with cornbread filled stomachs, warmed hearts, and reminded everyone that simple food could still be good food. Giblet gravy over rice was one of those dinners that showed how nothing went to waste in the kitchen. Chicken was expensive, but the innards, the gizzard, liver, and heart, were cheap or sometimes even given away by butchers. My grandmother chopped them small, simmered them in broth, and thickened the pot into a rich gravy that smelled like Sunday supper. Poured over rice, it became hearty enough to stretch across the whole family. The rice soaked up the flavor, turning a small handful of giblets into a meal that fed 6 mouths without complaint. Some children turned up their noses at first, but hunger taught quick appreciation, and the taste of the gravy was strong, savory, and full of life. She said, "Giblet gravy was proof that dignity came not from the cut of meat, but from the hands that prepared it." In the 1960s, this dish carried people through lean nights, filling bowls with warmth when little else could be afforded. Giblet gravy over rice was frugality turned into something satisfying. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Fried bream with hush puppies was a meal born from rivers, ponds, and hands that knew how to fish. Bream, small and plentiful, cost little more than the time spent catching them. My grandmother cleaned the fish, rolled them in cornmeal, and fried them crisp in hot oil until the skin crackled golden brown. Hush puppies bubbled alongside, little cornmeal fritters that were cheap to mix and cooked quickly. Together, they made a dinner that felt rich without draining a wallet. Families gathered around plates piled high, dipping hush puppies into hot sauce or eating them plain while the fish cooled. The taste was pure Southern tradition, simple, salty, and tied to the land and water. In the 1960s, when grocery stores were expensive, fishing poles and cast nets provided meals for families who had little to spare. Fried bream with hush puppies was more than food. It was a reminder of resourcefulness and community, where the catch of the day fed everyone at the table. Pumpkin stew with onions was the kind of dish that proved homegrown vegetables could anchor a meal. Pumpkins were easy to plant, easy to store, and yielded enough flesh to keep a family fed for weeks. My grandmother peeled chunks of pumpkin, cooked them down with onions, and let the pot simmer until it turned thick and savory. The sweetness of the pumpkin mixed with the sharpness of onion, creating a balance that felt hearty and satisfying. Sometimes she added a little pepper or a leftover bone for extra flavor, but even plain, the stew was filling. Served with bread or cornbread, it was enough to feed a household without meat or costly ingredients. In the 1960s, pumpkins were not just for pies or holidays. They were staples, pulled from backyard gardens and turned into supper. The stew carried warmth, thrift, and creativity in every spoonful. Pumpkin stew with onions showed that survival did not mean going without taste, only learning to love what the land gave freely. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs was another way families stretched cheap vegetables into full meals. Turnips were easy to grow and often given away, their strong flavor softened by boiling them until tender. My grandmother ladled the hot turnips into bowls and topped them with crumbled cornbread, the bread soaking up the broth until it became hearty enough for supper. It was plain food, yes, but it kept stomachs full on nights when meat was scarce. The bitterness of the turnips mellowed with time and seasoning, and the cornbread gave every bite body and comfort. Children might have grumbled, but they ate their fill because there was no room for waste. In the 1960s, this dish was common across kitchens that relied on ingenuity to make ends meet. It was a simple combination, yet it carried dignity because it represented survival. Boiled turnips with cornbread crumbs may not have been fancy, but it held families together through lean times. Chicken wing stew was one of those meals that would surprise modern ears, since wings were once the cheapest part of the bird. My grandmother bought them in bulk when she could, piling them into pots with onions, celery, and carrots. Slowly simmered, the wings gave up their fat and flavor, turning thin broth into rich gravy. She thickened it with flour or cornstarch, serving it hot over rice or bread to stretch it even further. It was messy eating, but no one complained because the taste was so comforting. Wings may be prized today, but in the 1960s they were scraps, turned into nourishment by clever hands. She said every part of the bird had value if you treated it with respect. Chicken wing stew carried the spirit of thrift, transforming what others dismissed into something that filled the house with warmth. It was proof that good cooking did not depend on wealth, only patience and care. Pork cracklin cornbread was a dish that made even a simple pan of bread feel like a celebration. Cracklins, Small, crispy bits left from rendering pork fat were cheap to come by and packed with flavor. My grandmother folded them into cornbread batter, the fat melting and the crunchy pieces scattering through every slice. Baked until golden, it came out hearty and rich, with texture that plain cornbread never had. The salty pork balanced the sweet cornmeal, making each bite feel indulgent even though the ingredients were inexpensive. Families sliced it thick and ate it alone or alongside beans, greens, or stews, letting the cracklins carry the flavor of meat through the whole meal. In the 1960s, this kind of dish made families feel proud, as though they had something special on the table despite the hardships around them. Pork cracklin cornbread was thrift turned into joy, simple food lifted by the spirit of making do. Fried rice with scrambled egg was the kind of supper that could be made out of almost nothing but still managed to feel hearty. Leftover rice was saved from the night before, reheated in a skillet with a little oil or lard, and then combined with scrambled egg to add richness. My grandmother would sometimes add chopped onion or green pepper if the garden allowed, but the dish stood strong even without extras. The rice fried up golden, the egg binding it together into something more than scraps. A dash of salt and pepper finished it, though hot sauce often appeared at the table too. What amazed me was how it transformed simple grains into a filling plate that stretched across a family without breaking the budget. The meal carried warmth and thrift in equal measure, reminding everyone that dinner did not need meat to be satisfying. In the 1960s, fried rice with scrambled egg was not fancy, but it was dependable, the kind of dish that fed children and adults alike with just enough to keep spirits steady. Stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a dish that blended frugality with comfort in a way that stuck with families for decades. Okra, often grown in backyard gardens, went into a simmering pot with onions, tomatoes, and broth until it softened into a thick stew. My grandmother would mix simple cornmeal batter, drop spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, and let the dumplings cook until they puffed into tender bites. The texture of the okra thickened the stew naturally, giving it body without needing flour or cream. Each bowl carried the flavor of the garden, earthy and sustaining, with dumplings that filled the stomachs of tired workers. It was food that came straight from the soil and stretched further than its ingredients suggested. Children grew up eating this dish as a matter of routine, yet it became part of the rhythm of survival. In the 1960s, stewed okra with cornmeal dumplings was a staple that represented both thrift and ingenuity, turning humble vegetables and flour into something worthy of pride at the dinner table. Butter beans and rice were another cheap but comforting meal that carried families through lean times. Butter beans, with their creamy texture, were slow cooked until tender, often flavored with a smoked ham hock or bone if one was available. The smoky taste infused the beans and created a rich broth that poured beautifully over rice. My grandmother used long-grain rice that stretched a pot of beans into enough servings for the whole household. The dish was hearty, filling, and nourishing, feeding both body and spirit. Butter beans were inexpensive compared to meat, yet they carried enough protein to keep families going strong. Children learned to appreciate the soft beans and flavorful broth as part of everyday meals, and adults recognized their value in stretching budgets. It was not a dish of extravagance but of practicality, a dinner that turned cheap staples into something people looked forward to. Butter beans and rice told the story of resilience in kitchens where every penny counted and every plate needed to satisfy. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, she split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. Ham bone soup with vegetables was one of those meals where one piece of meat flavored an entire pot. A single ham bone, stripped of most of its meat, simmered for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the broth turned rich and smoky. My grandmother would add beans or greens if she had them, letting the flavors meld into something far more substantial than the ingredients suggested. Families gathered around steaming bowls, dipping bread into the broth and savoring the flavor the bone had left behind. It was frugal cooking at its finest, taking scraps and stretching them into nourishment. The soup fed many mouths, warmed cold nights, and made do with what was available. In the 1960s, when meat was costly, a ham bone could be the centerpiece of dinner, proving that thrift and patience could coax flavor out of nearly anything. Ham bone soup with vegetables carried both practicality and comfort in every ladleful. Fried green tomatoes with grits was a cheap Southern classic that carried both tradition and thrift in every bite. Unripe tomatoes, plucked before they spoiled, were sliced, dredged in cornmeal, and fried until golden in a skillet of hot oil or bacon fat. My grandmother paired them with bowls of creamy grits, the cornmeal base that stretched across countless households for pennies. The tomatoes were tangy and crisp, the grits soft and warm, creating a contrast that satisfied both hunger and taste. It was food that came straight from the garden and pantry, without needing costly additions. Families ate it often in the summer when tomatoes grew in abundance, but it found its way to the table year-round. The combination of fried green tomatoes with grits represented resilience, resourcefulness, and the comfort of tradition. In the 1960s, this meal stood as proof that good food did not depend on wealth, but on knowing how to use what you had wisely. Fish head stew was a dish born out of necessity, yet it carried surprising depth and flavor. Fish heads, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and rice until they yielded every ounce of richness to the broth. My grandmother insisted the heads made the stew better than filets, providing body and nourishment that nothing else could. The bones and skin flavored the liquid until it turned hearty and comforting. Potatoes stretched the meal, rice thickened it, and vegetables added substance, turning scraps into a filling supper. The taste was strong, earthy, and unforgettable, reminding everyone that no part of food should go unused. For Black families in the 1960s, fish head stew was a common way to stretch the catch of the day, ensuring nothing went to waste. It became a lesson in thrift and gratitude, proof that survival demanded creativity. Fish head stew was both humble and mighty, sustaining families through lean times with flavor and tradition. Homemade cornmeal pancakes for supper were another way families stretched basic ingredients into a filling meal. Flour, cornmeal, lard, and milk came together in a batter that fried into golden cakes on a hot skillet. My grandmother served them stacked, drizzled with syrup if any was available, or eaten plain with butter when syrup was gone. The pancakes were fluffy yet hearty, giving enough energy to hold a family until morning. They cost next to nothing but fed many, which was exactly what mattered most. Children loved the sweetness when syrup was added, while adults appreciated the sheer substance of the cakes. In the 1960s, cornmeal pancakes were a staple when meat was scarce, turning humble ingredients into something warm and reliable. It was comfort food born of necessity, one of those meals that never left memory even as times changed. Homemade cornmeal pancakes carried the spirit of thrift, filling plates with love and survival. Pork fatback and cabbage was a skillet dish that showed how even scraps of pork could bring life to vegetables. Fatback, mostly fat with little meat, rendered down in a hot pan until it sizzled, releasing flavor into the cabbage. My grandmother would slice the cabbage thin and cook it until tender, soaking up the richness from the fat. The result was savory, smoky, and filling, even though it was made from ingredients most considered cheap or undesirable. Families paired it with cornbread or rice, stretching it further into a full supper. It was food that came from thrift, but it carried a taste that lingered long after the plates were cleared. In the 1960s, fatback and cabbage was a reminder that flavor did not come from abundance, but from knowing how to cook with care. It was a dish that taught respect for every part of the animal and every leaf from the garden. Pork, fatback, and cabbage turned scraps into sustenance. Vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was one of the cleverest ways to turn leftovers into a comforting meal. My grandmother gathered whatever vegetables were left from the week, beans, carrots, peas, or turnips, and simmered them in a simple gravy. She poured the mixture into a dish and covered it with biscuit dough instead of pie crust, which baked into a golden, fluffy topping. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, stretching scraps into something that felt like a Sunday supper. Each slice carried both thrift and comfort, a reminder that nothing from the kitchen was wasted. The biscuit crust gave the dish substance, making it a true dinner instead of just a side. In the 1960s, vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was common across homes that relied on ingenuity, turning odds and ends into meals that filled plates and warmed hearts. It was survival, wrapped in comfort, food that told the story of resourceful families making the most of what they had. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was a clever twist on an old classic that fit the budget of Black families in the 1960s. Instead of pricey white potatoes, sweet potatoes from the garden were boiled, mashed, and spread on top of a filling made from scraps of meat and vegetables. My grandmother would use whatever was left, bits of beef, chicken, or even pork, chopped small and cooked with onions, carrots, or peas until it formed a savory base. The sweet potato topping baked into a golden layer that balanced the salty meat with a touch of natural sweetness. It was hearty enough to fill everyone, but cheap enough to make even during lean weeks. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in many southern gardens, and they stretched farther than most vegetables because they were filling and rich in flavor. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was more than just food. It was a statement of ingenuity. Families made do with what they had and still put something warm and comforting on the table. That golden crust represented thrift and care, carrying both survival and love in every spoonful. Stewed chicken backs were one of those meals that turned scraps into sustenance. In the 1960s, the back of the chicken was considered the cheapest cut, with little meat clinging to the bones. My grandmother bought them in bulk, cleaned them, and simmered them for hours with onions, potatoes, and carrots until the broth grew rich and fragrant. The long cooking softened the bits of meat so they slid easily from the bones, creating a meal that was both filling and flavorful. Families served the stew over rice or with cornbread, stretching the broth even further. The dish carried smoky undertones if she added a ham bone or a splash of fatback, but it was nourishing even without extras. What made it memorable was how something so overlooked could still feel satisfying and dignified at the table. Stewed chicken backs reminded families that nothing should be wasted, and even the smallest scraps could anchor a full dinner. It was a meal of patience, thrift, and creativity, proof that the cheapest part of the bird could still feed a household with warmth and pride. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and onion were a dish that stretched garden vegetables into something filling and satisfying. Bell peppers were inexpensive when in season, and my grandmother made the most of them by stuffing each with seasoned rice, onions, and sometimes a bit of tomato. Meat was optional and often absent, but the rice itself carried enough substance to make the meal complete. The peppers were baked until tender, their skins blistering slightly while the rice absorbed every bit of flavor. Each stuffed pepper became its own little meal, portioned perfectly for children and adults alike. The aroma of roasted peppers and onions filled the house, signaling comfort even when budgets were stretched thin. It was a dish that looked impressive despite being made from humble ingredients, and it reminded families that presentation mattered too. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and onion carried both thrift and pride, proving that even in hard times, dinner could be hearty, healthy, and beautiful on the table. Barbecue pig ears were a dish that showed how deeply rooted thrift and tradition were in Black cooking. Pig ears were among the cheapest cuts, often discarded or sold for pennies at butcher shops. My grandmother cleaned them carefully, simmered them until tender, and then finished them with homemade barbecue sauce that clung to every bite. The texture was chewy but flavorful, and paired with cornbread or greens, it became a meal that carried both satisfaction and culture. Families gathered around plates of pig ears during weekends or special occasions, treating them as a delicacy despite their humble beginnings. The sauce was smoky, tangy, and rich, masking the simplicity of the cut with layers of flavor. Eating barbecue pig ears was about more than just nourishment. It was about making something from nothing, about honoring traditions that valued every part of the animal. In the 1960s, dishes like this kept families connected to heritage and survival alike. Barbecue pig ears turned scraps into a meal that was cheap but never forgotten. Vegetable soup with garden leftovers was a dish born from necessity and creativity. My grandmother gathered whatever vegetables were left at the end of the week, beans, carrots, peas, corn, or turnip greens, and simmered them in a pot of broth. Sometimes she added rice, pasta, or even potatoes to bulk it up, creating a soup that stretched far beyond its humble ingredients. Each pot tasted different, depending on what was on hand, but it always felt hearty and comforting. Cornbread was served alongside, crumbled into bowls to soak up every drop of broth. It was a way of cleaning out the fridge without wasting anything, a meal that proved scraps could still sustain. Families in the 1960s relied on dishes like this to carry them through lean weeks, stretching pennies into nourishment. Vegetable soup with garden leftovers was both frugal and flavorful, carrying the ingenuity of women who made sure nothing went to waste. It was survival disguised as comfort, one pot feeding many with warmth, pride, and love. Hot water cornbread and fried fish scraps were one of the most inventive pairings my grandmother served. Hot water cornbread was made quickly, mixing cornmeal with boiling water and frying it into golden patties that crisped beautifully on the outside. It was fast, cheap, and filling, the kind of bread that appeared often at the table. To go with it, she fried scraps of fish, tails, heads, or thin trimmings left over from larger catches. What some saw as waste became supper, seasoned and fried until crispy. The two together made a meal that cost almost nothing but filled everyone at the table. The cornbread carried smoky richness, while the fish scraps provided flavor and protein. It was food that came from resourcefulness, proof that nothing was discarded if it could be eaten. Hot water cornbread and fried fish scraps carried the legacy of thrift, turning overlooked parts into a dinner that felt whole. Families remembered these meals not just for their flavor, but for their lesson in survival. Turnip green pot pie was a dish that blended creativity with thrift, transforming greens into the centerpiece of a meal. My grandmother cooked the greens down with onion and broth until tender, then poured them into a dish and covered them with pie crust or biscuit dough. As it baked, the crust turned golden and flaky, soaking in the juices of the greens below. It looked like a Sunday supper, even though it was made from humble garden vegetables. Families sliced into the pot pie and found warmth, substance, and a reminder that greens were not just a side dish, but a main course. Paired with cornbread or beans, it became a meal that stretched across households. In the 1960s, this kind of resourcefulness kept families going, proving that with care and imagination, Even simple greens could feel special. Turnip green pot pie was proof that hard times did not mean giving up pride at the table. Drop your favorite cheap dinner in the comments. Hit like if you got hungry and subscribe for more stories from the kitchen table.